Section 21 of From the Latchkey of My Book House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Latchkey of My Book House, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Shakespeare, William. English, born 1564, died 1616. Further reading, Master Skylark, A Story of Shakespeare's Time by John Bennett. Beyond Sir Hugh Clopton's noble old stone bridge that spans the Avon with 14 splendid arches rise the quaint gables and cathedral spire of good old Stratford town. In the days of Queen Elizabeth the houses were ancient plaster buildings crossed with timber, and each had at the sides or rear a gay little garden vivid with colour. In one of the best of those houses on Henley Street lived Master Will Shakespeare, a high-spirited lad with a fine courtly bearing and pleasant hazel eyes. His father, John Shakespeare, was a well-to-do merchant, a trader in hides, leather goods, wool, meats, and goodness knows what else. He had once been high bailiff or mayor of the town. His mother, Mary Arden Shakespeare, was sweet and womanly, and the boy loved her dearly. Happy indeed was his merry little home circle. Over in the old grammar school, whose jutting second story abutted on the street, Master Will and the other Stratford urchins learned their lessons. But it was a gay and joyous life, in spite of lessons, that they led in Stratford town. For Warwickshire in those days was divided into two well-marked divisions by the river Avon. To the south lay the rich green pasture land of Feldon, stretching away to the blue line of the distant Cotswold hills, and dotted here and there by herds of cattle and flocks of snow-white sheep. Amid little clumps of protecting elms nestled cosy homesteads, and past the well-tilled fields flowed placid rivers, their limpid waters overhung by alders and silver willows. To the north of the Avon, however, there was no cultivated land but the wild free forest of Arden, sweeping out over hill and dale for 20 miles, the delight of all boyish hearts. When school-time was over, then, for Will Shakespeare and the other Stratford boys, it was hey and a ho for the forest of Arden. Oh, the sweetness of those woodland haunts, the exhilaration and breadth and joy! The boys raced through leafy covert and sunny glade past giant oaks and tangled thickets, now skipping from stone to stone across the brawling brooks, now cleaving the woodland stillness with their shrill young voices. Sometimes a dappled herd of deer would sweep away before them across an open lawn or twinkle through the leaves amid the shadowy bracken, while groups of timid rabbits fed here and there on the tender leaves. Will Shakespeare talked with every keeper and woodman in the forest, and knew intimately all the ins and outs of that glorious sylvan life. At times, too, young Will wandered through all the picturesque towns and little forest villages round about, past the old grey castles and abbeys that loomed within their parks shut off by palings from the wilderness of Arden. Some of these castles had been abandoned and dismantled during the Wars of the Roses. Silent now as the surrounding forest they stood, half-ruined and haunted with shadowy memories of lords and ladies and all the stately revelry that had once held sway within their walls. It was a country full of interest, full of history, full of story, full of stirring border legends of the days when the English stood sturdily against the insurgents of Wales. Every hill and stream, every grim old abbey and castle had its heroic tale of long ago. On market days and fair days there was great excitement in the town itself for Master Will Shakespeare, for Stratford was the centre of a great grazing and agricultural district. On a bright summer's day, Will would rise with the sun and make off from Henley Street to watch the droves of slow oxen come crowding in over Clopton Bridge, and the herds of Herefordshire cows lowing anxiously after their skittish young calves. Then he would follow the cattle to Rother Market, where the cattle dealers gathered about Market Cross, and observe the humours of the ploughmen and drovers, scarcely less stolid and deliberate of movement and speech than their oxen. Over by the High Cross, a solid stone building with steps below and open arches above, the traders in corn and country produce held market. A gay and lively scene was Stratford on market day. Not far from Stratford lay the little forest village of Snitterfield, where Will's grandfather and Uncle Henry Shakespeare had farms. Every boundary tree and stone, every pond and sheep pool, every barn and cattle shed on the way to his Uncle Henry's farm Will knew by heart, for he dearly loved the place and spent many a happy day there. At Snitterfield, Will trotted around after his uncle, poking into all the byres and barns and poultry yards, and the man was charmed at the boy's eager interest. Now and again, from a safe nook on the bushy margin of a pool, he enjoyed the fun and excitement of the sheep washing, or watched the mysteries of the sheep shearing. Then he would remain to the shearing feast and see the young maid who was chosen queen of the festival receive her rustic guests and distribute among them her gifts of flowers. Indeed, young Will Shakespeare's youth was passed amid the labours and pastimes, the recurring festivals and varying round of a rural community. Each incident of the year, seed time and harvest, summer and winter, brought its own group of picturesque merrymakings in those forest farms and villages. The chief holiday of all was May Day, with its masks and morris dances, its hobby horses making continuous merriment, and its maypoles decked with gay-coloured streamers and fragrant garlands. What a day it was! In the streets of Stratford, leafy screens and arches were erected, and everywhere were garlands of flowers, brought in from the forest at dawn by rejoicing youths and maidens. A spontaneous outburst of joy, a gladsome welcome to the reawakening life and vernal freshness of the spring. Sometimes, too, there were acted out on May Day the exploits of Robin Hood and Maid Marian, but it was usually at Whitsuntide, the next important holiday after May Day, that those exhibitions nearest play acting were given. What queer old pageants they were, following the procession of trade guilds and the usual holiday sports. The very oldest form of play that the people loved in England was the miracle or mystery play, presenting usually some tale from the Bible. At first, long years before Shakespeare's time, these plays had been given in the churches by the clergy. Then gradually they had moved out to the churchyard, and the actors had changed from the clergy to citizens, members of the various trade guilds. Later still, they were given on a cart, called the pageant cart, which was moved about from place to place, giving a performance wherever it stopped. They would play the story of Noah's flood, or Adam and Eve, or the destruction of Jerusalem, or some such subject. The lower part of the cart was draped with cloth which hid the wheels, and behind this screen the actors dressed and kept their machinery. In the destruction of Jerusalem, for example, it was necessary to keep there a quantity of starch to make a storm, some barrels which were rolled around to produce thunder, and a windlass to make an earthquake. The action of the play took place on the flat part of the cart, but sometimes the actors stepped down into the street, and the lower part of the cart had to be used whenever they wanted to present such a scene as the grim and gaping jaws of hell, whence issued devils dressed in black and yellow to represent flames. Herod and Pilate, Cain and Judas, and certain turbaned Turks and infidels, as well as the devil, were favourite characters of these mysteries. The devil wore black leather covered with hair and had a grotesque painted head, and most of the actors either wore masks or had their faces much painted. Vice was a constant attendant on the devil, but he gradually changed into a mere buffoon or clown. In time, morality plays became even more popular than the mysteries. In the moralities, all manner of vices and all manner of virtues were portrayed as persons who did battle with each other in order to gain possession of man's soul. It was some such performances as these that Will Shakespeare used to see as a boy, though in his day it was rather customary to draw the pageant cart up in the courtyard of some inn. The common people would then crowd around it, standing, while the richer ones paid a large fee to have seats in the balconies or windows of the inn that overlooked the courtyard. Coventry, a town near Stratford, was one of the chief centres for the production of miracle plays, and Shakespeare must have gone over there sometimes to see them. Moreover, the various trade guilds, plasterers, tanners, armourers, hosiers, etc., who presented the plays, were in the habit of visiting neighbouring cities, and doubtless performed in Stratford. When Will was only 5 years old, his father, then Mayor of Stratford, had especially invited the stage players to Stratford and started a series of performances in the Guildhall. Later, the best companies in the kingdom used to come to Stratford, including the Earl of Leicester's company from London. So young Master Will had plenty of opportunity to study the making and presenting of plays, to acquire a deep love for the theatre, and perhaps sometimes even to act himself and make friends with the players. But now, when Will was still little more than a boy, his father began to have business failures and his affairs to go down, down, down in the world, so the lad was taken from school and put to work to help out in his father's business. John Shakespeare had been imprudently extravagant in his prosperity, and now he simply lost his grip and let himself sink down under misfortune, shunning society and refusing to go to church or any public meeting. Sweet Mary Shakespeare, however, bore up nobly against their troubles, her spirit as calm and serene in the dark days as it had been in the bright. How the boy loved and admired his mother! She was to remain in his heart all his days as the very embodiment of every womanly virtue. Will sympathized with his parents in their troubles and was willing to do any kind of work to help them. Moreover, those very troubles awakened his independence and taught him to be scrupulously honourable in his own business dealings with others, a trait which he never forgot. An open, frank, generous young fellow was Will Shakespeare in those days, innately courteous and wholly lovable. When Will was only 18, he was often to be seen making off across the fields, pied with daisies, to the little hamlet of Shottery, which lay half concealed by aged elms, its cosy homesteads nestling amid blossoming fruit trees and brilliant gardens. Here, in a lovely old cottage with a quaint thatched roof, lived Anne Hathaway, the daughter of a friend of Will's father, a maid whom he had known all his life. In the garden and through the primrose lanes the two lingered often together, and soon there was news of their wedding. Boy that he was, Will was only 19 when his first daughter, Suzanne, was born. Now what was there to do? He had a family on his hands to support, and his father's business grew every day worse and worse. 2 years later, twins were born to him, a boy and a girl, Hamnet and Judith, and then an event occurred which made the young man decide that the only thing for him to do was to be off to London and seek there his fortunes as a player, as doubtless he had long desired to do. He was off hunting one day with some young comrades when they pursued a fine deer into Fullbroke Park, or perhaps across the shallow ford of the river to Charlecote Park, the property of a sour and gloomy old Puritan, Sir Thomas Lucy, a man of aristocratic pride and narrowness who hated all youthful frolics and merriment. Just as they had killed the buck, the youth fell in with one of Sir Thomas's keepers, who insisted violently that they had no right to hunt where they were, and accused them of deer stealing. Master Will defended himself right spiritedly against the charge, and so aroused the wrath of Sir Thomas that he complained to the Stratford authorities. They, fearing to offend so rich and powerful a man, doubtless let it be known to Will that he would better leave town for a time. Accordingly, behold young Will bidding his wife and babes farewell, and off for London town. It was about 1585 or 1587 when Will Shakespeare arrived in London. In those days, players were just beginning to be recognised as respectable folk. Certain writers of education, such as Greene and Peele and Marlowe, had been among the first to think the writing of plays a vocation worthy of their dignity, and were turning out plays vastly more like modern dramas than the old morality and miracle plays. 10 years before, Queen Elizabeth had given the Earl of Leicester's players the first legal permit to act in certain places in London, and James Burbage, the leader of these players, had built the Theatre at Shoreditch, just outside the boundaries of London, for Mayor and Common Council still frowned on plays within the city. In building his theatre, Burbage took his plan from the old courtyards of the inns where it had been customary to draw up the pageant carts. The square yard where poorer people stood became the pit of the theatre, the pageant cart the stage, and the windows whence the wealthier class had looked on, the gallery or boxes. The stage and galleries were the only part of the building covered, which was none too comfortable for people in the pit if a sudden storm came pelting down. But rude as this theatre was, to Burbage belongs the honour of first establishing theatres as a part of city life, and removing from actors the stigma of being strolling players. Here at the theatre, Master Will first found occupation by holding the horses of the gallants who attended and organising a corps of boys to help him, but he soon advanced from that work to acting within the theatre, then to writing over faulty old plays, and at last to writing those splendid plays of his own. In a very short time he had surpassed all the dramaticists of his day, Greene and Peele and Marlowe and all, and held the foremost place in the hearts of the play-going public. Yet with his success he kept his head marvellously well, avoiding all the wild dissipations of his fellow dramatists, though he loved life and mirth as well as any and hadn't a trace of harshness or severity in his character. He worked hard, studying at French and Italian in his spare time, saving money for his family and making yearly visits to Stratford. He was first a member of the Earl of Leicester's Players, which later became the Lord Chamberlain's Company and the favourite company of the Queen. All the players in London in those days, save for certain bands of children players, were divided into two companies, the Lord Admiral's and the Lord Chamberlain's. The theatres where Shakespeare's plays were given were the Globe, erected outside the city, and Blackfriars, which was practically in the city. The actors played at the Globe in summer and at Blackfriars in the winter. Blackfriars was completely roofed in and lit by torchlight, so performances could be given there in the evening. But at the Globe the pit was uncovered, and performances were only given by day. The common people had a merry time standing in the pit, munching apples and nuts, while the aristocrats had their own boxes, wherein the ladies occupied the seats with the gentlemen reclining at their feet. If they chose, they played cards during the performance, and there were always pages ready to attend upon them. Whoever paid extra could sit upon the stage itself. There was no scenery on that stage, and a simple printed placard announced the name of the place where the scene was supposed to be laid. Women's parts were taken by men. It was not until long after Shakespeare's time that women appeared on the stage. The hoisting of a flag and blowing of a trumpet bade all be still to hear the play. What an age of awakened national life and stirring spirit was that of Elizabeth, when the minds of men had burst the bonds of the Dark Ages and were eagerly inquiring and adventuring everywhere. Along the riverside and in noble houses on the Strand were the hardy mariners and adventurous sea captains, Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher, who had driven their dauntless keels fearlessly into the unknown seas of the New World in order to push back the limits of man's knowledge. The greater number of eager and excited listeners who crowded the rude theatres from floor to roof had shared the adventurous exploits of the age, and all felt the keenest interest in life and action. So the drama of the day became the mirror in which all of these active forces were reflected. And beside the Americas, there was another new world which men were most anxious to explore in that age of awakened inquiry, the world of human nature, heretofore left so little questioned and understood. All the traits and impulses of that nature, good and bad, its high hopes and aspirations, its fears and sorrows, its bigness and its littleness, there was need of a chart to point them all out. Into that unknown sea sailed the intrepid mariner Shakespeare, and charted it in his mighty dramas as none other has ever done. The great Columbus of the newly discovered world of man's heart and mind and spirit. For 20 years he worked actively in London, 20 long years, but at last a great wave of home yearning called him back to the primrose lanes of Stratford. He had already bought a fine house there for his family, and here he settled down to spend his remaining days in peace and quiet, honoured and loved by all. No other man ever knew the hearts of men and women as Shakespeare did. He still remains the greatest dramatist of all ages and all races, who wrote, "Not for an age, but for all time." Further reading, Tales from Shakespeare by Charles and Mary Lamb. End of section 21.